Okay, so thank you everyone for joining today. I am here to talk about Docker, especially Docker trends and everything you want to know about Docker today. And for next 20 to 25 minutes, I will be talking about Docker, especially why we need Docker and what are the current trends. And then after that, I will be open for Q&A where you can drop your questions in the Facebook and we will be taking that. So let me get started. So let us start with something statistics, right? Because everyone likes statistics. So I will pick up a kind of a Gartner recent report where Gartner talks about, okay, by 2023, 70% of the organization will be running three or more containerized application in production. Now you might be thinking about, okay, what's driving this significant growth? Now, there are three important patterns which you are going to see. The first one is containers, second one is Kubernetes, and the third one as a microservices application. So in this webinar, I am going to touch base on the first two, which is containers as well as a microservices application. So let's see why, why we are talking about 70% of the organization. That's huge, right? Now, think of it as like when we talk about a successful software development, so there is a general consensus saying like there are three important things which has to be in place. The first one is architecture, second one is process, and the organization. Now, to start with the organization, it is believed that when you have a small autonomous team, your organization tends to contribute on a small modules. Basically, you have a small team of engineers where you get them involved in building some kind of a module. Talking about the process, now agile is a process where your team is basically broken down into the smaller and a smaller team, and they can collaborate with each other and they can collaborate with each other to build the software. Now there is a general consensus saying like when you have a small organization and when you have an agile process, your software development life cycle is going to be really robust. Now, let's talk about the third one, which is monolithic versus microservices. Now, as we saw that Gartner has basically out of those three containers, Kubernetes, and microservices. Let's see like why Gartner is predicting based on the statistical report why the microservices is really important. So let me talk about monolithic first. So if you go back around like 15 to 20 years, your application has changed dramatically, right? So your application was kind of a big monolithic. It is a big blob of binaries and libraries. They were built on a single stack, just like .NET and Java. So there was a time where you take around 6 months of time to build some software. It is a long lived, and you deploy it in a single server. I do remember when you had a kind of an end user guide of around 100 pages, which mentions about, okay, what are the changes in the hardware. So it is very slow changing. It's a big server. Imagine that you are building a very complex application like online store. Now, if you closely look at monolithic, you have a front end, you have a business logic, and on the right hand side, as you see, we have a back end. Now, talking about a business logic, it is basically a different modules which you build and you package in the form of a jar or a var. So you call in the Java language, you call it as a jar, and in a Tomcat, you say it as a var, right? So so all these modules are packaged in the form of a monolithic application, which means that you just can't go ahead and make changes to it. Once you make the changes, you never know that that application is going to, you know, um, crash. So which means that your business logic needs some kind of, these are like they are very tightly coupled. You can't just go ahead and make the changes. Now, if you look at this monolithic application, there is a general consensus saying like every successful application keep growing. So when you work in any of the application, it might start with around 200 or 300 MB in size. And after 3 to 4 years, that grows to around 1 GB, right? Which means that whatever the application which you have built successfully, it keeps growing. But there are certain challenges which you face. Now, think of it as like The challenges in terms of making changes in terms of the technology. You just can't go ahead and make the changes in your technology. So one application which you have built in Java or .NET, and tomorrow if you come up with a new programming languages, it becomes very difficult. So there are certain demerits which we have seen with monolithic application. Now, talking about the microservices architecture, which means that your business logic is going to change in the way that every modules which we're talking about, catalog service, reviews, order service, has its own database, which means that I can go ahead and build a catalog service on .NET, whereas the review service, I can choose my own technology, which could be on Java, right? Earlier in a monolithic application, when you have a single application sitting in a one single server, you didn't have a flexibility to change the programming languages, right? But now each of these services are in the very microscopic, means these are like a microservices. There are small services having their individual database. In monolithic, we had a single database. Here we have a individual databases, and which are very small in size. Now, the benefits of microservices is like you can go ahead and scale this independently. Okay. So you don't have to scale the whole system itself. If I am working on an order system, okay, or if I am working on some kind of an order service, which means that I don't have to scale the whole system itself. I just can go ahead, concentrate on my service, which has its own database, and then make the changes without affecting the other. The other advantage is in monolithic, if you have a one component failure, which means that your whole system fails, right? But in microservices, one component failure is not going to affect the other, which means that your entire system doesn't have to go down. And one of the most benefit, I would say the point with the microservices architecture is you can use the latest technologies to build it. You might have seen the engineers coming in, the young engineers coming in and trying to recommend some kind of the languages, saying like, why are you using the old WordPress application? Why don't you go ahead and use some kind of a, you know, modern tools? So they can go ahead, they can play around with it. And when you feel like that's matured enough, you can absorb that. So that is one of the advantages. Now, microservices architecture are good, but think of it as like when you have hundred and thousand of those microservices, which means that you have hundred and thousand of those application which has to be scaled across a different environment. Think of it as like you build something, you as a developer build something on your laptop, and when it goes to the cloud, you never know that that stuff is going to work. Think of it as like when last week when I was working in some kind of an IoT devices like Jetson, I built some kind of an application, and if I take that application and deploy it on the cloud, you never know that that application is going to work. Which means that when the whole journey of your software is not smooth at all, moving from a development to test and QA, production and scale out. So you need to think of some kind of a tool which can help you help you make your application portable across all these software development life cycles. And that is where the Docker comes in. So Docker is the way how you basically package your application along with its dependencies, which means that, say, if I package some application on my laptop which is running on Windows, and when you go ahead and deploy it over the cloud which has a Windows instances, which means that that application carries all its libraries, binaries, dependencies, which allows you to run those applications everywhere, almost everywhere. And the other thing is it provides you with the isolation, which means that without impacting, you remember that in the microservices, we talk about an isolation where each of these microservices are the independent entities, right? And they talk to each other through the APIs. So Docker basically isolates the apps. It works on all the Linux distribution, pick up any of the Ubuntu, Debian, OpenSUSE, Red Hat, it works on top of it. And itself, today the containers are native to Windows Server and Windows 10 also. When you say Docker, it is based on the container-based technology. Now, you might be thinking about, okay, how is containers different from virtual machine? Now, if you look at the slides, you can see in a virtual machine, you start with the hardware, you have an host OS on top of it, and you have an hypervisor, which could be a a type 1 or type 2 hypervisor. But on top of it, you have a full-fledged virtual machine, which has a guest operating system, which means that if you deploy a kind of a Windows machine, it will be like, by default, it start with like 40 GB. Now, if I want to test some kind of a Python application, why do I need a complete operating system? And that is where the Docker comes into the picture. Now, looking at the right hand side, you have a containers. Basically, you have a base as a hardware. On top of it, on top of that, you have an host operating system, and then directly you run container on top of it using the Docker engine. And the way how it works is, you are basically eliminating those 40 GB of complete operating system. So when you say containers are just a user space of an operating system. When you talk about an operating system, right, it is made up of user space as well as a kernel space, but the kernel is something which is shared by all these containers. Now, why Docker is so damn popular? You might ask this question, right? Now, there are certain factors. So few of the important one is, it simplifies the lives of developers. As a developer, if you want to start developing some kind of an application, you don't want to spend so much time in building the infrastructure, right? Why should I really care about whether I am on the Linux or Windows, right? As a Python developer, I should have a Python application up and a Python environment up and running. It doesn't matter that I need to first. So think of it as like, today is the first day of in your office, and your manager comes and asks you about, okay, can you start working with the Python? And the first thing you ask is, okay, which OS shall I pick up, where Windows or Linux? So it shouldn't matter to you. You should have a kind of a containerized environment where you should have the environment where your Docker is installed, and that's it. You just say Docker pull Python, and you have a Python environment up and running. So it simplifies the lives of developers. It is portable for sure, because you build something on your laptop, it runs on cloud, it runs on IoT. It is very easy to deploy. Just think of it as like, run one command, right? If I want to install Ubuntu, what do you need? The first thing is, you need a server, or you need a kind of a laptop. On top of it, you need a CD drive. Burn it with Ubuntu, which is like 400 to 500 MB. Burn, and then you have to use some kind of an automation tools like Puppet and Terraform to build up some kind of application on top of it. For when we talk about Docker itself, right, it is just a matter of a single liner command, Docker pull Ubuntu, and that's it. You have an Ubuntu image sitting on top of your on your hard disk, and you just say Docker run, and you run it, right? So it is very easy to deploy your application. It shines for microservices architecture, because if you have ever worked with the Docker Compose, which builds the microservices architecture, you just have to specify one YAML file, and that's it. Just with one YAML file, I can build up a whole WordPress application, right? So you can use it for microservice architecture. The faster software delivery. Now, if you are in a DevOps world where you have to deal with the application, there is a lot of automation, CI/CD pipeline. So Docker can really help you to expedite that. It accelerates your software development cycle. And then it uses it like more efficient use of system resources. Think of it as like a virtual machine, which is using like around 40 to 50 GB of your Windows, to run a Windows host. In the same way, containers can be run in just like 600 to 700 MB. And if you talk about Linux, it is just like 20 to 30 MB, right? You can run your application on top of it. Now, these are the like, if you are a quite beginner, right? These are the vocabularies which you can go through it. It start with a Docker image. Now, you might be thinking about, what is Docker image and container. So Docker image is your full-fledged application. Okay, it is basically an instance of your complete file system which runs your application. Okay, when you run that Docker image, it becomes a container. So container, so most of the time, if you see, people might be saying like Docker container, Docker image. So it is just like, when you run a Docker image, it becomes a container, right? And as soon as you run those containers, we have a CLI platform where you can go ahead. So when you install Docker, you get a server and the client architecture, and you just have to run those kind of we have a specific command for running a containers as well as pulling on the images. And when you talk about what is the intelligent entity which is managing all of these things. It's a Docker engine. Okay, so Docker engine is the way how you build, ship, and run your container application deployable on any of the platforms. So once you run a Docker software on your machine, it comes with a Docker engine, either in the server or on the client architecture. Now you might be thinking about, now there are so many images which get built up. Where are those stored? And then you have a Docker Hub, which is like a registry service. So Docker Hub is a public registry service. In the same way, you can have your registry service inside your infrastructure, which means that today you have a flexibility of storing the images. You don't have to use a USB drive to carry those images. You can push it, you can pull it within a matter of seconds. So as I said, Docker is an open platform which helps you to build, ship, and run. Now, what is this build, ship, and run? When we talk about build and ship, it is more related to the developer. So as a developer, when you start building your application, you start building your Docker image, and that is the build part. When you push it to the Docker Hub, that is a ship part. Okay, and when you pull that image, when your colleague or a customer pull that image and run it, that becomes a run. So build is for a development environment, ship is like storing and creating the images, whereas runs helps you to deploy those application. And these application which you build on your laptop can be run on the cloud itself. So one of the question which I usually get is, okay, where I can run these Docker images and containers. So these are all the platforms. I would say most of the platforms today, I play around with IoT a lot. It has been like around 2 years. I have been playing around with the IoT projects. You know, you can run it on Raspberry Pi, Banana Pi, Orange Pi, Windows 10 laptop. You have a MacBook. You have a Docker desktop, the full-fledged Docker platform, which you can run on your Mac, on Windows. You can run it on the cloud, AWS, and then you have even GCP, Azure, everywhere you can run it. You can also install a virtual box and you can run on top of it. Today, you can even run it on a VMware environment too, right? So you have a flexibility, and those are like a diversified platform where you can run all those things. Now, thinking about looking at the statistic which developers like, this is a recent report from Stack Overflow which talks about, okay, how the Stack Overflow is basically a community of the developers where developers invest and they engage so much time to learn things. Today, if you are applying for any job, right, so usually Stack Overflow reputation is being seen, right? So these are like a very essential platform where developers spend most of their time. And look at the statistic. So in a Stack Overflow developer survey 2020, around 60,000 developers participated, and they have voted for Docker as a most the most wanted platform, second in the most loved, and then the third in the most used after Linux. So Linux is like one of the popular, but you just imagine that Docker is one of the platform where people spend more and more time with. Look at the pools. Right now you might be thinking about, so everyone, like every one of the individual, we have around 7 billion plus population, like, and out of that, those engineers, how if each of the engineers start pulling and pushing those images. Now this is a data which is coming from a Docker index. Now Docker index is like every after every 6 months, Docker publishes a statistic of the latest top Docker images in the form of a Docker index. Okay, if you go to docker.com website, you will see like every 6 months they are publishing it. And look at the number of pulls in just 1 month. It is like 11 billion. Okay, 11 billion pulls in last month. So this is the data which is coming on the month of July. In a June, there were like 11 billion pulls, which means that 11 billion times people have used it to deploy the application, to go ahead and run their application, build the application on top of either in the cloud or on-prem. And till now, 242 billion total pools on Docker Hub has been reported, which is like from around 6 to 7 years ago, right? So these are the pools which has happened, and there are around 7 million repositories, 7 million hub users. So it's a full-fledged kind of, it's a big community. And Docker is popular today because of the vibrating community. We do have a Slack channel where there are around like 20 to 30,000 plus people where you can go ahead and interact with them. And look at the installation. Even in the desktop, you have around 2.9 million desktop installation which has happened. Now you might ask, like, who is using Docker? And this is just a snapshot. Like, there are like hundreds and thousands of customers, right, who have been using it. Especially I'm talking about not customer but users, right? So these are the primary companies. There are prime companies who are using it. And these most of these companies were part of few of the meetup events which I did in Bangalore as well as in other states in India. But these people are using it, and these are coming from a different industry. It's a finance industries. Some are in a kind of an IoT industry, right? Especially if you have seen the robotic platform, you might have seen the video of the latest Boston dynamics. They have few of the robots dancing, which was published on the new in the new year day, right? So those runs on Docker itself. And these not it's not just like a kind of a hobby or something like that, but it is like a Docker is running in a production itself today. And it has been a part of your tech stack in most of the big companies, right? So I have worked in MNC in the last 13 years, and we have been using heavily inside the Redis lab. We used Docker heavily to go ahead, pull these images, bring up the NoSQL databases and all. And this is my last slide, which talks about, okay, you might be curious about, okay, I'm excited. I'm super excited now. How shall I start with Docker journey? So one of the first recommendation which I have is docs.docker.com. This is a documentation which you should start. But if you are really serious about going ahead and be a part of community, we have a Docker community Slack, which you can be part of it. Otherwise, I do have my own Slack channel, which has around 4,900 community members. We talk on a regular basis, especially on the daily basis, where you go ahead and you can contribute towards the Mobi projects, okay, which is again it falls under the umbrella of Docker falls under the umbrella of Mobi. So you go ahead, you pick up your technology, and you start contributing on top of it as a developer, as a product manager. So it is an open community. It is free of charge. It is just like you can join anytime. You start contributing on top of it. And dockerlabs.collabnix.com is a personal website, a personal community site where all the community members go ahead and contribute. So so we have a huge community members, especially in Bangalore as well as in India, abroad, who have been contributing, on the daily basis to this repository. So there's a lot of resources out there, but definitely you can start your Docker journey. And anyway, you can reach out to me in the Slack channel anytime, and I would love to collaborate and see like how we can collaborate together to contribute for Docker. Yeah, thank you.